Since time immemorial, there's been discussion upon discussion among Xeno fans about the idea of different Xeno games crossing over with each other, allowing Xenogears, Xenosaga, Numbered Xenoblade, and Xenoblade X characters to interact in some sort of canon way. But what happens when other series cross over with the Xeno games? You might think that because JRPGs are a fairly niche genre, and Xeno isn't one of the three biggest series in that it hasn't had a lot of crossovers. And maybe that's true in terms of at least the Nintendo-published Xenoblade games, but you would be surprised. So today, I'm just going to list off every single other series that I can find that some Xeno something has crossed over with, because I think that's funny and interesting. Only game I need to spoil here is Xenoblade 1, and that's just because one of the crossovers involves a Xenoblade 1 spoiler character being in a crossover game. There's only going to be a couple rules for this. The first is that it has to be a proper crossover, where even if there's no story significance to it, there has to be an actual Xeno character being able to be on screen at the same time as an actual character from another property. This means that the KOS-MOS figure item in Baten Kaitos Eternal Wings in the Lost Ocean doesn't count as Baten Kaitos crossing over with Xenosaga, because that's just a reference. It also means that Judith's KOS-MOS outfit in Tales of Vesperia doesn't count as a Tales of Xenosaga crossover, but KOS-MOS being in the same Project Cross Zone games as Yuri, Flynn, and Estelle does count. The thing with the Tales of series is that most games are set in completely separate universes to each other. So within reason, and as far as my own personal knowledge allows, I will also be keeping track of that. So if a series contains multiple universes, I'm going to be counting specifically which universes cross over with Xeno games. And although I'll be bouncing around in order a bit, I am going to be noting each time one of the three Xeno series crosses over with a different specific series separately. For example, Xenogears and Xenoblade have both crossed over with Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and Kingdom Hearts in different games, so I'm going to be noting all of those 6 cases separately. With that out of the way, I'm going to kind of go in an arbitrary order, at least somewhat working backwards from the present, because I think more recent things are the things people are more likely to know about. But that does leave us with the biggest crossover by volume for each of the 3 Xeno series first, and we're going to start with the biggest crossover any Xeno character has been a part of, that of course being Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Thanks to everyone being here, we don't need to talk about Smash 4 separately, and for my sanity's sake, I'm only going to be considering playable characters for Smash Ultimate and any of the tactics games in the Namco Cross Capcom lineage, because if I listed every single video game IP referenced in a Smash spirit, this would not be a Xeno video anymore. Anyway though, Shulk, Pyra, and Mithra are in Smash, which gives Xenoblade crossovers with Mario, or technically only Super Mario, with Donkey Kong, Yoshi, and Wario being counted as separate series by Smash itself. The Legend of Zelda. It's all technically different permutations of the same universe, but every era of the Zelda timeline is actually covered. Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time for the Unified timeline, Zelda from A Link Between Worlds for the Downfall timeline, technically Young Link in Ultimate is from Majora's Mask in the Child timeline, and Wind Waker Toon Link in the Adult timeline, with regular Link being representative of the era of the Wild, which might be some, none, or all of the above. Metroid, Kirby, Star Fox, Pokemon, possibly the only franchise in Smash with a more complex multiverse than Xeno. I don't know how to qualify this, but I guess just the main non-Mega Evolution timeline and the Mega Evolution timeline, because Pokemon Trainer is from Fire Red and Leaf Green, and Lucario can Mega Evolve. No Mystery Dungeon here, it seems, unfortunately. Mother, F-Zero, Ice Climber, Fire Emblem, which does have multiple universes, so we need to take a little bit of a closer look here. There are no playable characters from either Yggdrasil game or either version of Valentia, but those are in the same universe as Arcanea. So we have that universe, Elebe, Teleus, Fire Emblem Fates Unnamed World, and Fodlan, leaving out only Magvel and the crossover realms of both Heroes and Engage. The concept of the Game & Watch handheld line, Kid Icarus, Metal Gear, specifically the main timeline I guess, Sonic, specifically the main timeline I guess, Pikmin, Rob, the real-world toy, Animal Crossing, Mega Man, specifically the original universe, Wii Fit, Punch-Out. It does surprisingly count me as a series, and while you could probably break that down to Wii Sports, Find Me, Tomodachi Life all being separate universes, I don't want to think about that. Pac-Man, I don't know if Pac-Man has an established canon that's enough to have multiple universes, but Pac-Man is in Smash. Duck Hunt, Street Fighter. The Final Fantasy representation in Smash is so garbage that even the official Smash website only considers it to be FF7, so specifically Final Fantasy VII. Bayonetta. Weirdly, the Smash Ultimate website specifically lists Bayonetta 2, although there is a multiverse now as of 3, so yeah, specifically the Bayonetta from Bayonetta 1 and 2. Splatoon. Castlevania, the main timeline. Persona, which does have multiple universes and is part of the larger Mega 10 multiverse. 3, 4, and 5 are definitely in the same universe, but I don't know if it's ever been established where 1 and either version of 2 sits relative to that, so we're just gonna leave it at that for Persona. Dragon Quest, with the 4 different versions of Hero covering the universe Dragon Quests 11, 1, 2, and 3 take place in, the universe Dragon Quest 4 takes place in, which may or may not be the same one as 5 and 6 depending on who you ask, and the universe Dragon Quest 8 takes place in. Then we have Banjo-Kazooie. And next is Terry Bogard, and I don't know how to count him. He is listed specifically as a Fatal Fury character. That is his series icon, that is the hat he's wearing, that is what the Smash website refers to him as. However, his stage is King of Fighters Stadium. The King of Fighters Fatal Fury continuity is not the same continuity as the Fatal Fury continuity from the Fatal Fury games, even though a lot of the same events happen. But there are characters that only appear in King of Fighters on the stage. So I'm just gonna count that this Terry is a superposition of both the Fatal Fury Terry and the KOF Terry, and just say it's a crossover with both. And then finally, rounding out Smash, ARMS, the general concept of Minecraft. I don't think this Steve is from any particular seed. Tekken, and Kingdom Hearts. I'm just counting all of Kingdom Hearts as one universe. We're not getting into that. So yeah, that's the biggest montage we're ever going to see from Xenoblade, and outside of specifically Project Cross Zone 2, there's not going to be any other crossovers with that series. But what do you think the biggest crossovers Gears and Saga were part of are? Surprisingly enough, it's arguably not Cross Zone for Saga. And because the Gears one is a Final Fantasy gacha, we're going to talk about a gacha on the Saga side. That being Tales of the Rays, a only fairly recently defunct Tales of gacha crossover game that had a lot of collabs with other series. And surprisingly enough, this one never had a Persona 5 collab. The Xenosaga crossover event, adding KOS-MOS as a playable character and then a few other Xenosaga based outfits for other Tales of characters, was the last collab it did. So yeah, we did it. Live service killed by Xenosaga and not Persona 5. That's never really happened before, I guess. Now we just need to see if this goes recursive. Like, do a Xenosaga crossover in P5X and see if that causes it to EOS or not. Like, is combining two things that have EOS other gachas going to cancel out, or is it just going to kill the host game for the collab? Science. Yeah. Anyway, Tales of the Rays, in addition to having its own stable of OCs, also includes characters from every single Tales of game, including OCs from other Tales of crossover mobile games and the Tales of the World trilogy. So not only is every single Tales of universe covered, every single non-canon universe crossing over the Tales of universes is covered. That's how comprehensive we're going here. Anyway, as this is a Bandai Namco gacha game, it could cross over with other Bandai Namco stuff. And note that I'm saying stuff, and not just video games. And that's because while the first crossover was the Idolmaster Stella stage, alright, that is a Bandai Namco published video game, that makes sense, even though it's very funny that you can have that with Tales of characters. And the second is Valkyrie Anatomia The Origin, the Valkyrie Profile series gacha, which, alright, yep, that is a Square series, but it is developed by Tri-Ace, and there's other Tri-Ace stuff in here. The third one is Sword Art Online. KOS-MOS and Kirito can take the stage of battle together. Or they could, because Tales of the Rays is defunct, but that was a thing you could do for a little bit back there. The next was the Idolmaster Cinderella Girls. This is a series I know nothing about, but that's a mobile game. The other one was a console game, so maybe that's a separate universe. Then is God Eater Resident Ops. That series has one timeline, and this mobile game is actually part of it, so that's nice and simple. Then Star Ocean Anamnesis, which is the other Tri-Ace property here. That is Star Ocean's mobile gacha crossover, but the only playable characters are Claude and Rena from Star Ocean 2. So I'm going to count this as the main Star Ocean universe and not non-canon crossover gacha universe, because it is only canon characters. And then things just start getting really funny, because next is Gintama, then Slayers, then, alright, .hack GU, that makes sense, not going to comment anything on that. Then Danmachi, Black Clover, Guilty Gear Strive for some reason, Tiger and Bunny, Magical Circle Guru, which is not something I had ever heard of. Then Scarlet Nexus, okay, that one makes sense, we can calm down a little bit. Then the last thing, before Xenosaga was Sergeant Frog. Also can cross over with KOS-MOS. That was a thing you could do. We're done with this game now. We're gonna move on to the Xenogears. The gacha Xenogears was in. It's not gonna get any better. Help. The gacha in question is Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. It is also defunct, and I wouldn't even be mad with them doing a Xenogears crossover event if it wasn't just another example of Square only viewing Gears as a nostalgia tool for milking people for as much money as possible with overpriced merch, and trying to relegate it to being a Final Fantasy spin-off when it exists as its own IP specifically because it was rejected being Final Fantasy VII. Anyway though, this is primarily a Final Fantasy crossover gacha, which means it automatically crosses Xenogears over with its own OCs, all 16 mainline Final Fantasy games, Tactics as well for an extra double up on Ivalice, Type 0, and even World of Final Fantasy, which saves me the trouble of giving it its own separate segment where I mention its Xenogears themed super boss. Here's where things get kind of messy though. Documentation in any language on the game is not great, and several collab events were Japan exclusive, which means I'm basically just looking through bits and pieces on a very poorly optimized wiki that doesn't contain complete information, and the Spriters resource, just to get an idea of all the other things that there were crossovers for. So I might miss a few, but I'm gonna do the best I can. I'm going to try and start just with other Square RPGs and then branch out from there. As far as Dragon Quest goes, there were crossovers with 11S, the Adventure of Dai manga, and the Dragon Quest Monsters mobile game, Dragon Quest Monsters Super Light, that was only ever released in Southeast Asia and yet was in the international version of Brave Exvius for some reason, so that had a few characters and monsters from across the Dragon Quest series. I don't know how to count that, but they're Xenogears and Dragon Quest together. This is also where Gears gets its crossover with Kingdom Hearts. As far as Team Asano series, there was an Octopath Traveler 1 collab, as well as units from Bravely Default 1, Bravely 2nd, and the Japan-only free-to-play mobile game Bravely Default Fairies Effect, all of which take place in the same universe. There was a Nier Automata one, which, very surprisingly, this is the only crossover any Xeno game has with Nier. A bunch of different mana games, I think all 5 mainline ones, and possibly more. I can't quite tell because all the collabs of that series except the Secret of Mana one were Japan only for some reason, even though Brave Exvius was contemporary with the Mana series actually becoming accessible worldwide finally. Romancing Saga 3, Imperial Saga, and Saga Frontier were also all JP only collabs, even though 2 of the 3 of those are mainline titles that have been translated, so don't know what was going on with that not being worldwide. Chrono Cross got a couple characters, saving me another segment where I would talk about the Luca cameo in Xenogears itself. I don't know if I'm supposed to count Crystal Defenders because I think it's technically also Ivalice, but the extremely poorly received Tower Defense mobile game that EOS, like, right after Brave Exvius dropped in the first place? Sure, why not? Parasite Eve is also in there too, which you wouldn't know if you looked at the list of collabs. I had to scroll through the list of every unit in both the worldwide and Japanese versions. In a table you have to scroll sideways to get to every column of on a fandom wiki, just to confirm there were in fact 2 versions of Aya you could get. Going back to Tri-Ace, Valkyrie Profile and Star Ocean also got crossovers. The Valkyrie Profile one this time was Valkyrie Profile Lenneth, a remake of the first game. Star Ocean was Anamnesis again, but in this case, it was just a main character from each of the 5 mainline Star Ocean games, and a second from Star Ocean 3. So this is also Xenogears crossing over with mainline Star Ocean, which yes, means that in several places, Xenogears and Xenosaga have 2 degrees of separation, but they never themselves have appeared in the same game with each other. Only Saga and Blade have done that. Then, for non-JRPG former Square IPs, Deus Ex Mankind Divided, Just Cause 3, and specifically Lara Croft and the Temple of Osiris got crossovers. I don't know what that means for Tomb Raider. I don't know how the timelines work in that series, but that's the version of Lara Croft that's in this game, I guess. There is also the Mistwalker-developed mobile RPG Terra Battle, which, surprisingly, that was the one that got the crossover and not Fantasian, even though Square seems very happy to publish that nowadays. I forgot ActRaiser Renaissance. That was there too. Missed a Square game. Oops. I'm not going back to edit that in. This is such a cluster already. I don't really care anymore. I just want to get onto Cross Zone. Oh, I don't know if this counts as an RPG, but there was also a King's Knight crossover. Thank you, Final Fantasy XV, for making Square think that King's Knight is a nostalgic legacy IP that people care about for a little bit. That was weird. Oh, and I missed another one. Xeno Alice. The Yoko Taro directed mobile game that isn't near Reincarnation or any of those weird card ones. I didn't count the Rathalos boss in Smash Ultimate, though I honestly probably should have as a Xenoblade Monster Hunter crossover, but there's a Gears one as well, as Monster Hunter Explorer. That mobile game got to be in Brave Exvius. Brave Frontier, another mobile JRPG that I've never heard of before, with gameplay similar to Valkyrie Profile apparently, even though it had nothing to do with Tri-Ace, also got a crossover. I'm assuming that's just because they both start with Brave. I think that's every video game. I could very easily be wrong, but now we have 3 series that were published in Square's monthly Shonen Gangan magazine. The first one is Fullmetal Alchemist, specifically listed under the Brotherhood anime. That one makes sense. That's like pretty Final Fantasy adjacent, honestly. Then, Magical Circle Guru Guru is back. That certainly wasn't one of the properties I expected to be giving Gears and Saga 2 degrees of separation, but it sure is. Then lastly out of those 3 is Nangoku Shonen Papuwa-kun, a series that ran from 1991 to 1995, and then had a sequel that ran from 2002 to 2008. What any character from this series is doing in a 2015 gacha game, I couldn't tell you, but they are there. And, saving the weirdest for last, there were also 3 crossovers with Western music artists for some reason. Addison Rae, Katy Perry, and Ariana Grande are just in this Final Fantasy gacha game as playable units. Square let Xenogears cross over with 3 real people before Xenosaga or Xenoblade. The craziest thing about this is, the Final Fantasy XIV representation in Brave Exvius is so god-awful that the only playable characters are some of the Scions in their ARR forms, including Minfilia, who is not a combatant, and then Y'shtola from Shadowbringers, and nobody else. There is no Graha Tia in this game whatsoever, as far as I can tell. Xenogears crossed over with Ariana Grande as herself, who acted alongside Jonathan Bailey in the Wicked movies. The same Jonathan Bailey who is the English voice actor for Graha Tia. Xenogears is almost more connected to the English voice actor of one of the most popular characters from the most popular modern Final Fantasy game than the character himself. Just so I don't completely lose it, we're gonna talk about the one other Gears thing here. Back in 2016, when Square was really trying to get into the esports market, they released a team-based mecha shooter called Figureheads and did a few collabs with other games. One of them was Xenogears, and the trailer and this collab was some of the highest resolution official Xenogears character art was ever published in, and I'm really mad that we couldn't get, like, actual PNGs of this stuff. Also, there might have been new voice acting from the original Japanese VAs for the Gears characters, which is crazy. Anyway though, it had 3 other collabs that I could find any info on. The first one was Front Mission First, okay, that makes sense. The second is Schoolgirl Strikers, which was a Square game, but it was a card-collecting mobile RPG with visual novel elements and a heavy social aspect. Nothing to do with mecha. And then the third one, Armored Trooper Vodums. This is the only time any Xeno game has actually gotten to be in an official crossover with one of the classic mecha series that may have inspired its creation in the first place. And it was in what is, by all accounts, a very middling third-person shooter where you couldn't even properly represent the Xenogears characters, that never got a worldwide release and died after 2 years. So yeah, pretty typical for Square's treatment of Gears. We're going to talk about more exciting stuff. We got Cross Zone. We're going to start with Cross Zone 2, weirdly enough, because that has KOS-MOS and Fiora in it, which means every property that appears here is crossing over with both Saga and Blade. So we're going to start with this, and then loop all the way back to the beginning of the Reiji and Xiaomu saga that just happens to have KOS-MOS and maybe sometimes some other Xenosaga characters. In the Cross Zone games, units are either pairs of characters that are directly controlled, or solo characters that can only be called in as an assist. I'm going to count both of those because those are technically all playable characters, and they are like relevant team members as far as the story is concerned. So this gives us Resident Evil, Devil May Cry, only the universe of the original games, thank God. X and Zero are partners, giving the original Mega Man universe a Saga crossover as well, and a second point on the timeline for Blade. Strider, Shinobi, Street Fighter for Saga, Tekken for Saga, which also saves me the trouble of having to give a special segment to Kazuya Mishima emailing Shion in Xenosaga 1, apparently meaning that he's canon to that universe, and friends with Shion apparently, so I wonder if they bonded over having family members named Jin that they don't quite get along with. Darkstalkers for both, Virtua Fighter, Sakura Wars, the original, not the reboot, Yakuza, also the original and not the reboot? Apparently I have to say that now or something. I don't know what's going on with that series anymore. Resonance of Fate, Namco Cross Capcom, which basically started its own series of crossover characters, so I'm counting Reiji and Xiaomu as their own IP, basically. I'd only really consider this as a crossover for Blade, though, because there just are Xenosaga characters in actual Namco Cross Capcom. The original Dot Hack for both Blade and Saga, and Dot Hack GU for Blade. Tales of Vesperia for Blade. God Eater for Blade. Saga and Blade for each other, because as far as we know, KOS-MOS Refrain from Xenoblade 2 is a separate character from the original KOS-MOS and isn't a crossover version of her. She's just a separate character who looks, sounds, and acts like KOS-MOS, so that doesn't count, though this might not even be a crossover anymore after a couple more Xeno games. And Chrom and Lucina being the other Nintendo collab unit, funnily enough gives us Fire Emblem Arcanea for Xenosaga. Moving on to solo units, we have Ace Attorney, Captain Commando, Star Gladiator. I don't know if Ingrid counts as a different series or not from Street Fighter because she's technically a Capcom Fighting Evolution character but debuted in a Street Fighter Alpha game. Space Channel 5, Streets of Rage, Nightshade, Shenmue, Adventures of Valkyrie, Soul Calibur specifically 5, but I think they're all on the same timeline, or it got rebooted after 5, which is good because KOS-MOS was only a costume in I believe Soul Calibur 3. Summon Night 3, and last but most certainly not least, Segata Sanshiro is a playable character in Project Cross Zone 2. I don't know what series I count him under. Do I just count him under advertising the Sega Saturn? Do I count him under real life? Do I count him under Kamen Rider? I don't know, but he's there, and he interacts with KOS-MOS and Fiora. That is a thing, and it's kind of amazing. And now we need to take a trip back to 2005 with the original Namco Cross Capcom, as there are in fact 3 games in continuity with the Cross Zone games that came before them. The cool thing about Namco Cross Capcom is that it came out in 2005, which means it predates Xenosaga 3 and was probably somewhat in development at the same time as Saga 2. That means the Saga representation is actually from episode 1, and Momo and Shion join KOS-MOS this time. This is neat because in both Cross Zone games, KOS-MOS is in version 4, though of course version 1 is also a very iconic look for her, also appearing sometimes in crossovers, and of course being the basis of KOS-MOS Refrain from Xenoblade 2's design. Anyway though, ignoring series I already mentioned in Cross Zone 2, Namco Cross Capcom gives Xenosaga crossovers with Bravo Man, the Tower of Druaga, Klonoa from Klonoa, but then also Gunts from Klonoa 2 Dream Champ Tournament, an arguably non-canon GBA game, so that might be 2 separate Klonoa universes here. Burning Force, Baraduke, Soul Edge, which maybe should count under Soul Calibur, but whatever, Genpei Tomaden, Shadowland, Dig Dug, Wonder Momo, Ghosts and Goblins. I'm going to count Final Fight and Rival Schools as separate here because I don't know if they'd been officially canonized into Street Fighter at the time. Dino Crisis, Forgotten Worlds, which I ironically almost forgot to say in the script. And it's not a new universe, but there is Mega Man Legends representation in this game too, so that's kind of neat that between Blade and Saga, we have 3 very, very different eras of the main Mega Man universe getting crossed over. And I think that's neat, especially because the one doing the crossing over is another blue robot. Anyway though, in between Namco Cross Capcom and Project Cross Zone 1, there were 2 other games that somewhat continued the crossover story of KOS-MOS and Reiji and Xiaomu. Those are Super Robot Tyson OG Saga Endless Frontier, and its Japan-only sequel, Endless Frontier Exceed. These games are part of the Super Robot Wars series, so most of the characters in them are from other Super Robot Wars games, with basically only KOS-MOS, Telos, Reiji, Xiaomu, I think Momo's also in the second game, and a few other supporting characters and enemies from Namco Cross Capcom and Xenosaga being in there as guests. This sounds extremely cool, and it is. These are basically Super Robot Wars spin-offs featuring OCs from across the series and new OCs with the gameplay style of Namco Cross Capcom instead of a usual Super Robot Wars game. But these are Super Robot Wars OG Saga games, so they are a spin-off of a sub-series of Super Robot Wars that only focuses on OCs and doesn't have crossovers from any other mecha IP. So this does give Xenosaga crossover with not just the Endless Frontier characters, but basically every Super Robot Wars continuity as of the early 2000s, though it does not get Xeno any other crossovers with any of the mecha that inspired it, though it has 2 degrees of separation with like every Gundam up to I think 00, Getter Robo, Mazinger Z, Daitetsujin 17, all the stuff like that that you know inspired various things from Xenogears and Xenosaga. It's just only Vodum's got to be directly in the same game with something Xeno. And we don't really need to talk anything more about those games because a few characters from them also appear in Project Cross Zone 1. Cross Zone 1 also had a few OCs that apparently were not very popular because they were just replaced in the protagonist role by Reiji and Xiaomu in Cross Zone 2 and don't even show up in that game. So there you go. Kogoro Tenzai and Mi Koryuji, you are technically a different universe that crossed over with Xenosaga. Oh, and the Super Robot Wars characters that appear are specifically Haken Browning and Kaguya Nanbu, the protagonists of the original Endless Frontier, as well as Sanger Zonvolt, who originated from the Super Robot Wars Alpha games, so I do think it was worth bringing up the 2 Endless Frontier games separately because there are other Super Robot Wars continuities as well, and Exceed's own OCs that aren't covered by this game. Given how this is now the 3rd game we're looking at that crossed over Namco and Capcom, there's not a lot of new entries, but the addition of Sega does bring Valkyria Chronicles. Only 3 is represented by playable characters, but they're all in the same universe. Shining Force Exa. I don't know what the Shining continuity is, but I'm assuming this very, very far removed from Camelot game isn't directly connected to the original games. From Namco, Eumeria. From Capcom, Cyberbots and Dead Rising. Dynamite Cop, Zombie Revenge, and Fighting Vipers. So yeah, I think that means Saga has the most crossovers, and that's especially true because we're technically not done yet. The 2003 Namco-developed tactics game Venus and Braves has KOS-MOS in it as just an interactable event character. The Wikipedia article, at least in English, erroneously claims that this only appears in the 2011 PSP remake, but I was able to find clips and screenshots of her in the PS2 version from earlier than 2011. I'm assuming the confusion just arises from the fact that there are also Tales of cameos in the game, and the PSP version added cameos from games that didn't exist in 2003, like Vesperia. And then there is baseball. I'm going to be brutally honest with you. There is basically zero English information available about this stuff, so we're going to touch on this very, very, very lightly. The Family Stadium, or Famista series, is a very long-running Namco sports game. In fact, the original NES RBI Baseball is actually a localized version of the first Famista game, which was called Pro Baseball Family Stadium in Japanese. A few other titles in the series were also localized under various names over the years, but the important part about this series is that some entries have a Namco team comprised of actual other Namco characters. This started out as just a character named after KOS-MOS, but she eventually started showing up with bespoke graphics for herself, and was in a lot of games after the Xenosaga series had started, most recently appearing in Famista Dream Match, the 2014 gacha. Many Namco series I've already mentioned are represented there. Like, there's a lot of Tekken, there's a lot of Soul stuff, and there's a lot of Tales of stuff and all that, but there are several other, especially classic Namco characters, that are also present in this series. And this is not going to be an exhaustive list because I'm just going off of what I was able to find in English documentation. But this is where you finally get the Xenosaga Pac-Man, both regular Pac-Man and Ghostly Adventures Pac-Man, which is very scary, crossovers. You get Ridge Racer, Xevious, Mappy, Taiko no Tatsujin finally. Kind of surprised it took that long for that one. And several other things like that. Also, Katamari. Weird it took this long for Katamari to happen. Ace Combat's in there as well. I think this one makes at least a little bit more sense than the actual spaceships from arcade games or Car from Ridge Racer being in there, because at least there are characters in the planes in that series. Also, more Idolmaster stuff. I keep forgetting Idolmaster started as a video game series, weirdly enough. But yeah, if you wondered where Baseball, Shion, and KOS-MOS were from, this is the series. Unfortunately, none of the localized ones are the ones that have the Xenosaga stuff in them, so I can't easily confirm any of this, besides just looking at random screenshots and referencing a Xenobits video from several years ago. The real problem is, I can find lists of characters that were on the Namco team at some point, including Lupin III apparently, but I cannot tell which were in the games KOS-MOS was in, or even the total amount of games KOS-MOS was in, period. So I think the safest thing to say is, okay, some of the series I just mentioned, those also crossed over with Xenosaga. Famista technically has OCs, so the Famista universe has also crossed over with Xenosaga. Actual Japanese players showed up in some of the games as well, so there you go, you got a Xenosaga real-life crossover, regardless of your opinions on Segata Sanshiro. And end the video before I go completely insane. That sounds like a very good idea. Until next time, this is Luxon, signing off. Like, I know baseball's big in Japan and they have their own league, so if Xenosaga ever comes back and they do some sort of Famisa cross promotion, they'll do it in Japan, but I think it would be really funny to have someone dressed up as KOS-MOS throw the first pitch at an MLB game. I'm not even into baseball, and I'd probably buy a ticket and take the trip just to see that because of how funny it would be, and that is technically a tax write-off for me. The more you know. Please don't kill me, IRS.